Section 19 of And Even Now by Max BEERBOHM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 19. On Speaking French. 1919. Whenever two Englishmen are speaking French to a Frenchman, you may safely diagnose in the breast of one of the two humiliation, envy, ill will, impotent rage, and a dull yearning for vengeance. And you can take it that the degree of these emotions is in exact ratio to the superiority of the other man's performance. In the breast of this other are contempt, malicious amusement, conceit, vanity, pity, and joy in ostentation. These also exactly commensurable with his advantage. Strange and sad that this should be so, but so it is. French brings out the worst in all of us. All, I mean, but the few, the lamentably far too few, who cannot aspire to stammer some colloquial phrases of it. Even in Victorian days, when England was more than geographically, was psychologically, an island, French made mischief among us, and was one of the devil's favourite ways of setting brother against brother. But in those days the bitterness of the weaker brother was a little sweetened with disapproval of the stronger. To speak French fluently and idiomatically and with a good accent, or with an idiom and accent which to other rough islanders seemed good, was a rather suspect accomplishment, being somehow deemed incompatible with civic worth. Thus the weaker ones had not to drain the last lees of their shame, and the stronger could not wholly rejoice in their strength. But the old saving prejudice has now died out, greatly to the delight of the devil, and there seems no chance that it will be revived. Of other languages no harm comes. None of us, none at any rate outside the diplomatic service, has a feeling that he ought to be master of them. In every recent generation a few men have learned Italian because of the Divina Commedia, and a very few others have tried Spanish with a view to Cervantes, and German has pestered, not always vainly, the consciences of young men gravitating to philosophy or to science. But not for social, not for any oral purposes were these languages essayed. If an Italian or a Spanish or a German came among us, he was expected to converse in English, or spend his time in visiting the sights silently and alone. No language except French has ever... But stay! There was, at the outbreak of the war, a great impulse toward Russian. All sorts of people wanted their children to be taught Russian without a moment's delay. I do not remember that they wanted to learn it themselves, but they felt an extreme need that their offspring should hereafter be able to converse with moujiks about icons, and the Little Father, and anything else, if there were anything else, that moujiks cared about. This need, however, is not felt now. When, so soon after his debut in high politics, M. Kerensky was superseded by M. Lenin, Russian was forthwith deemed a not quite nice language, even for children. Russia's alphabet was withdrawn from the nurseries as abruptly as it had been brought in. Le chapeau de la cousine du jardinier was re-endued with its old importance. I doubt whether Russian would, for more than a little while, have seemed to be a likely rival of French, even if M. Kerensky had been the strong man we hoped he was. The language that succeeded to Latin as the official mode of intercourse between nations, and as the usual means of talk between the well-educated people of any one land and those of any other, had an initial advantage not quite counterbalanced by the fact that there are in Russia myriads of people who speak Russian, and a few who can also read and write it. Russian may, for aught I know, be a very beautiful language. It may be as lucid and firm in its constructions as French is, and as musical in sound. I know nothing at all about it. Nor do I claim for French that it was by its own virtues predestined to the primacy that it holds in Europe. Had Italy, not France, been an united and powerful nation when Latin became désuet, that primacy would, of course, have been taken by Italian. And I cannot help wishing that this had happened. Italian, though less elegant, is, for the purpose of writing, a richer language than French, and an even subtler. And the sound of it spoken is as superior to the sound of French as a violin's is to a flute. Still, French does, by reason of its exquisite concision and clarity, fill its post of honour very worthily, and will not in any near future, I think, be thrust down. Many people, having regard to the very numerous population of the British Empire and the United States, cherish a belief that English will presently be the cock of the world's walk. But we have to consider that English is an immensely odd and irregular language, that it is accounted very difficult by even the best foreign linguists, and that even among native writers there are few who can so wield it as to make their meaning clear without prolixity, and among these few none who has not been well grounded in Latin. By its very looseness, by its way of evoking rather than defining, suggesting rather than saying, English is a magnificent vehicle for emotional poetry. But foreigners don't much want to say beautiful, haunting things to us. They want to be told what limits there are, if any, to the power of the Lord Mayor. And our rambling endeavours to explain do but bemuse and annoy them. They find that the rewards of learning English are as slight as its difficulties are great, and they warn their fellows to this effect. Nor does the oral sound of English allay the prejudice thus created. Soothing and dear and charming that sound is to English ears, but no nation can judge the sound of its own language. This can be judged only from without, only by ears to which it is unfamiliar. And, alas, much as we like listening to French or Italian, for example, Italians and Frenchmen, if we insist on having their opinion, will confess that English has for them a rather harsh sound. Altogether, it seems to me unlikely that the world will let English supplant French for international purposes, and likely that French will be ousted only when the world shall have been so internationalised that the children of every land will have to learn, besides their own traditional language, some kind of horrible universal lingo, begotten on Volapük by a congress of the world's worst pedants. Almost I could wish I had been postponed to that era. So much have I suffered through speaking French to Frenchmen in the presence of Englishmen. Left alone with a Frenchman, I can stumble along, slowly indeed, but still along, and without acute sense of ignominy. Especially is this so if I am in France. There is in the atmosphere something that braces one for the language. I don't say I am not sorry even so for my Frenchman, but I am sorrier for him in England. And if any Englishman be included in the scene, my sympathy with him is likely to be lost in my agony for myself. Would that I had made some such confession years ago. Oh, folly of pride! I liked the delusion that I spoke French well, a delusion common enough among those who have never heard me. Somehow I seemed likely to possess that accomplishment. I cannot charge myself with having ever claimed to possess it, but I am afraid that when any one said to me, I suppose you speak French perfectly?' I allowed the tone of my denial to carry with it a hint of mock modesty. 'Oh, no,' I would say, 'my French is wretched,' rather as though I meant that a member of the French Academy would detect lapses from pure classicism in it. Or, 'No, no, mine is French pour rire,' to imply that I was practically bilingual. Thus, during the years when I lived in London, I very often received letters from hostesses asking me to dine on the night when Madame Chose or Monsieur Tel was coming. And always I excused myself, not on the plea that I should be useless. This method of mine would have been well enough, from any but the moral standpoint, had not Nemesis, taking her stand on that point, sometimes ordained that a gall should be sprung on me. It was not well with me then. It was downfall and disaster. Strange how one will trifle with even the most imminent doom. On being presented to the gall, I always hastened to say that I spoke his or her language only un tout petit peu, knowing well that this poor spark of slang would kindle within the breast of Monsieur Tel or the bosom of Madame Chose hopes that must so quickly be quenched in the puddle of my incompetence. I offer no excuse for so foolish a proceeding. I do but say it is characteristic of all who are duffers at speaking a foreign tongue. Great is the pride they all take in airing some little bit of idiom. I recall, among many other pathetic exemplifiers of the foible, an elderly and rather eminent Greek who, when I was introduced to him, said, 'I am jolly glad to meet you, sir,' and, having said that, had nothing whatever else to say, and was, moreover, unable to grasp the meaning of anything said by me, though I said the simplest things, and said them very slowly and clearly. It is to my credit that in speaking English to a foreigner I do always try to be helpful. I bear witness against Madame Chose and Monsieur Tel that for me they have never made a like effort in their French. It is said that French people do not really speak faster than we, and that their seeming to do so is merely because of their lighter stress on syllables. If this is true, I wish that for my sake they would stress their syllables a little more heavily. By their omission of this kindness, I am so often baffled as to their meaning. To be shamed as a talker is bad enough. It is even worse to be shamed in the humble refuge of listener. To listen and from time to time murmur 'C'est vrai' may seem safe enough. Yet there is danger even here. I wish I could forget a certain luncheon in the course of which Madame Chose, that brilliant woman, leaned suddenly across the table to me and, with great animation, amidst a general hush, launched at me a particularly swift flight of winged words. With pensively narrowed eyes, I uttered my formula when she ceased. This formula she repeated in a tone even more pensive than mine. 'Mais je ne le connais pas,' she then loudly exclaimed. 'Je ne connais pas même le nom. Dites-moi de ce jeune homme.' She had, as it presently turned out, been asking me which of the younger French novelists was most highly thought of by English critics, so that her surprise at never having heard of the gifted young Sévres was natural enough. We all, but no, I must not say that we all have painful memories of this kind. Some of us can understand every word that flies from the lips of Madame Chose or from the mouth of Monsieur Tel. Some of us can also talk quickly and well to either of these pilgrims, and others can do the trick passably. But the duffers are in the great grim majority, and the mischief that French causes among us is mainly manifest not, I would say, by weaker brethren hating the strong, but by weak ones hating the less weak. As French is a subject on which we all feel so keenly, a point of honour on which we are all so sensitive, how comes it that our general achievement is so slight? There was no lack of hopes, of plans, that we should excel. In many cases, time was taken for us by the forelock, and a French nurse installed. But, alas, little children are wax to receive and to retain. They will be charmingly fluent speakers of French within 6 weeks of Mariette's arrival, and will have forgotten every word of it within as brief an interval after her departure. Later, their minds become more retentive, though less absorbent. And then, by all means, let French be taught. Taught it is. At the school where I was reared there were 4 French masters. 4. But to what purpose? Their classrooms were scenes of eternal and incredible pandemonium, filled with whoops and catcalls, with devil's tattoos on desks, and shrill inquiries for the exact date of the Battle of Waterloo. Nor was the lot of those 4 men exceptional in its horror. From the accounts given to me by 'old boys' of other schools, I have gathered that it was the common lot of French masters on our shores. And I have often wondered how much of the Anglophobia recurrent among Frenchmen in the 19th century was due to the tragic tales told by those of them who had returned from our seminaries to die on their own soil. Since 1914, doubtless, French masters have had a very good time in England. But even so, I doubt whether they have been achieving much in the way of tutelage. With the best will in the world, a boy will profit but little by 3 or 4 lessons a week, which are the utmost that our system allows him. What he wants, or at any rate will want, is to be able to cope with Madame Chose. A smattering of the irregular verbs will not much avail him in that emprise. Not in the dark byways of conjugation, but on the sunny field of frank social intercourse, must he prove his knighthood. I would recommend that every boy, on reaching the age of 16, should be hurled across the Channel into the midst of some French family, and kept there for 6 months. At the end of that time, let him be returned to his school, there to make up for lost time. Time well lost, though, for the boy will have become fluent in French, and will ever remain so. Fluency is all. If the boy has a good ear, he will speak with a good accent. But his accent is a point about which really he needn't care a jot. So is his syntax. Not with these will he win the heart of Madame Chose, not with these the esteem of Monsieur Tel, not with these anything but a more acrid rancour in the silly hostility of his competitors. If a foreigner speaks English to us easily and quickly, we demand no more of him. We are satisfied. We are delighted. And any mistakes of grammar or pronunciation do but increase the charm, investing with more than its intrinsic quality any good thing said, making us marvel at it and exchange fatuous glances over it, as we do when a little child says something sensible. But heaven protect us from the foreigner who pauses, searches, fumbles, revises, comes to standstills, has recourse to dumb show. Away with him by the first train to Dover. And this, we may be sure, is the very train Monsieur Tel and Madame Chose would like to catch whenever they meet me. Or you? End of section 19. Section 20 of And Even Now by Max BEERBOHM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 20. Laughter. 1920. Monsieur Bergson, in his well-known essay on this theme, says, well, he says many things, but none of these, though I have just read them, do I clearly remember, nor am I sure that, in the act of reading, I understood any of them. That is the worst of these fashionable philosophers, or rather the worst of me. Somehow I never manage to read them till they are just going out of fashion, and even then I don't seem able to cope with them. About 12 years ago, when everyone suddenly talked to me about pragmatism and William James, I found myself moved by a dull but irresistible impulse to try Schopenhauer, of whom, years before that, I had heard that he was the easiest reading in the world, and the most exciting and amusing. I wrestled with Schopenhauer for a day or so, in vain. Time passed. Monsieur Bergson appeared, and for his hour was lord of the ascendant. I tardily tackled William James. I bore in mind, as I approached him, the testimonials that had been lavished on him by all my friends. Alas, I was insensible to his thrillingness. His gaiety did not make me gay. His crystal clarity confused me dreadfully. I could make nothing of William James. And now, in the fullness of time, I have been floored by Monsieur Bergson. It distresses me, this failure to keep pace with the leaders of thought as they pass into oblivion. It makes me wonder whether I am, after all, an absolute fool. Yet surely I am not that. Tell me of a man or a woman, a place or an event, real or fictitious. Surely you will find me a fairly intelligent listener. Any such narrative will present to me some image, and will stir me to not altogether fatuous thoughts. Come to me in some grievous difficulty, I will talk to you like a father, even like a lawyer. I'll be hanged if I haven't a certain mellow wisdom. But if you are by way of weaving theories as to the nature of things in general, and if you want to try those theories on someone who will luminously confirm them, or powerfully rend them, I must, with a hangdog air, warn you that I am not your man. I suffer from a strong suspicion that things in general cannot be accounted for through any formula or set of formulae, and that any one philosophy, howsoever new, is no better than another. That is, in itself, a sort of philosophy, and I suspect it accordingly. But it has, for me, the merit of being the only one I can make head or tail of. If you try to expound any other philosophic system to me, you will find not merely that I can detect no flaw in it, except the one great flaw just suggested, but also that I haven't, after a minute or two, the vaguest notion of what you are driving at. Very well, you say. Instead of trying to explain all things all at once, I will explain some little, simple, single thing. It was for sake of such shorn lambs as myself, doubtless, that Monsieur Bergson sat down and wrote about laughter. But I have profited by his kindness no more than if he had been treating of the cosmos. I cannot tread even a limited space of air. I have a gross satisfaction in the crude fact of being on hard ground again, and I utter a coarse peal of laughter. At least, I say I do so. In point of fact, I have merely smiled. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I should have laughed, and have professed to you that I had merely smiled. A very young man is not content to be very young, nor even a young man to be young. He wants to share the dignity of his elders. There is no dignity in laughter. There is much of it in smiles. Laughter is but a joyous surrender. Smiles give token of mature criticism. It may be that in the early ages of this world there was far more laughter than is to be heard now, and that eons hence laughter will be obsolete and smiles universal, everyone always mildly, slightly smiling. But it is less useful to speculate as to man's past and future than to observe men. And you will have observed with me, in the club-room, that young men at most times look solemn, whereas old men, or men of middle age, mostly smile. And also that those young men do often laugh loud and long among themselves, while we others, the gayest and best of us, in the most favourable circumstances, seldom achieve more than our habitual act of smiling. Does the sound of that laughter jar on us? Do we liken it to the crackling thorns under a pot? Let us do so. There is no cheerier sound. But let us not assume it to be the laughter of fools, because we sit quiet. It is absurd to disapprove of what one envies, or to wish a good thing were no more, because it has passed out of our possession. But it seems that I must begin every paragraph by questioning the sincerity of what I have just said. Has the gift of laughter been withdrawn from me? I protest that I do still, at the age of 47, laugh often and long and loud, but not, I believe, so long and loud and often as in my less smiling youth. I am proud nowadays of laughing, and grateful to anyone who makes me laugh. That is a bad sign. I no longer take laughter as a matter of course. I realize, even after reading M. Bergson on it, how good a thing it is. I am qualified to praise it. As to what is most precious among the accessories to the world we live in, different men hold different opinions. There are people whom the sea depresses, whom mountains exhilarate. Personally, I want the sea, always, some not populous edge of it for choice, and with it sunshine and wine and a little music. My friend on the mountain yonder is of tougher fibre and sterner outlook, disapproves of the sea's laxity and instability, has no ear for music and no palate for the grape, and regards the sun as a rather enervating institution, like central heating in a house. What he likes is a grey day, and the wind in his face, crags at a great altitude, and a flask of whisky. Yet I think that even he, if we were trying to determine from what inner sources mankind derives the greatest pleasure in life, would agree with me that only the emotion of love takes higher rank than the emotion of laughter. Both these emotions are partly mental, partly physical. It is said that the mental symptoms of love are wholly physical in origin. They are not the less ethereal for that. The physical sensations of laughter, on the other hand, are reached by a process whose starting point is in the mind. They are not the less gloriously of our clay. There is laughter that goes so far as to lose all touch with its motive, and to exist only, grossly, in itself. This is laughter at its best. A man to whom such laughter has often been granted may happen to die in a workhouse. No matter. I will not admit that he has failed in life. Another man, who has never laughed thus, may be buried in Westminster Abbey, leaving more than £1 million overhead. What then? I regard him as a failure. Nor does it seem to me to matter one jot how such laughter is achieved. Humour may rollick on high planes of fantasy or in depths of silliness. To many people it appeals only from those depths. If it appeal to them irresistibly, they are more enviable than those who are sensitive only to the finer kind of joke, and not so sensitive as to be mastered and dissolved by it. Laughter is a thing to be rated according to its own intensity. Many years ago, I wrote an essay in which I poured scorn on the fun purveyed by music halls, and on the great public, for which that fun was quite good enough. I take that callow scorn back. I fancy that the fun itself was better than it seemed to me, and might not have displeased me if it had been wafted to me in private, in presence of a few friends. A public crowd, because of a lack of broad impersonal humanity in me, rather insulates than absorbs me. Amidst the guffaws of 1,000 strangers, I become unnaturally grave. If these people were the entertainment, and I the audience, I should be sympathetic enough. But to be one of them is a position that drives me spiritually aloof. Also, there is to me something rather dreary in the notion of going anywhere for the specific purpose of being amused. I prefer that laughter shall take me unawares. Only so can it master and dissolve me. And in this respect, at any rate, I am not peculiar. In music halls and such places you may hear loud laughter, but not see silent laughter. Not see strong men weak, helpless, suffering, gradually convalescent, dangerously relapsing. Laughter, at its greatest and best, is not there. To such laughter, nothing is more propitious than an occasion that demands gravity. To have a good reason for not laughing is one of the surest aids. Laughter rejoices in bonds. If music halls were schoolrooms for us, and the comedians were our schoolmasters, how much less talent would be needed for giving us how much more joy. Even in private and accidental intercourse, few are the men whose humour can reduce us, be we never so susceptible, to paroxysms of mirth. I will wager that 9/10 of the world's best laughter is laughter at, not laughter with. And it is the people set in authority over us that touch most surely our sense of the ridiculous. Freedom is a good thing, but we lose through it golden moments. The schoolmaster to his pupils, the monarch to his courtiers, the editor to his staff. How priceless they are! Reverence is a good thing, and part of its value is that, the more we revere a man, the more sharply are we struck by anything in him, and there is always much, that is incongruous with his greatness. And herein lies one of the reasons why, as we grow older, we laugh less. The men we esteemed so great are gathered to their fathers. Some of our coevals may, for aught we know, be very great, but, good heavens, we can't esteem them so. Of extreme laughter, I know not in any annals a more satisfying example than one that is to be found in Moore's Life of Byron. Both Byron and Moore were already in high spirits when, on an evening in the spring of 1818, they went from some early assembly to Mr. Rogers' house in St. James's Place, and were regaled there with an impromptu meal. But not high spirits alone would have led the two young poets to such excess of laughter as made the evening so very memorable. Luckily, they both venerated Rogers, strange as it may seem to us, as the greatest of living poets. Luckily, too, Mr. Rogers was ever the kind of man, the coldly and quietly suave kind of man, with whom you don't take liberties, if you can help it, with whom, if you can't help it, to take liberties is in itself a most exhilarating act. And he had just received a presentation copy of Lord Thurlow's latest book, Poems on Several Occasions. The two young poets found in this elder's muse much that was so execrable as to be delightful. They were soon, as they turned the pages, held in throes of laughter that was but intensified by the endeavours of their correct and nettled host to point out the genuine merits of his friend's work. And then, suddenly, oh joy, we lighted, Moore records, on the discovery that our host, in addition to his sincere approbation of some of this book's contents, had also the motive of gratitude for standing by its author, as one of the poems was a warm and, I need not add, well-deserved panegyric on himself. The narrative has an added charm from Tom Moore's demure care not to offend or compromise the still surviving Rogers. Too far gone in nonsense for even this eulogy, in which we both so heartily agreed, to stop us. The opening line of the poem was, as well as I can recollect, "When Rogers o'er this labour bent," and Lord Byron undertook to read it aloud, but he found it impossible to get beyond the first 2 words. Our laughter had now increased to such a pitch that nothing could restrain it. 2 or 3 times he began, but no sooner had the words "when Rogers" passed his lips than our fit burst out afresh, till even Mr. Rogers himself, with all his feeling of our injustice, found it impossible not to join us. And we were, at last, all 3 in such a state of inextinguishable laughter that, had the author himself been of our party, I question much whether he could have resisted the infection. The final fall and dissolution of Rogers behaving as badly as either of them, is all that was needed to give perfection to this heart-warming scene. I like to think that, on a certain night in spring, year after year, 3 ghosts revisit that old room, and, without, I hope, inconvenience to Lord Northcliffe, who may happen to be there, sit rocking and writhing in the grip of that old shared rapture. Uncanny? Well, not more so than would have seemed to Byron and Moore and Rogers the notion that, more than 100 years away from them, was someone joining in their laughter, as I do. Alas, I cannot join in it more than gently. To imagine a scene, however vividly, does not give us the sense of being, or even of having been, present at it. Indeed, the greater the glow of the scene reflected, the sharper is the pang of our realisation that we were not there, and of our annoyance that we weren't. Such a pang comes to me with special force whenever my fancy posts itself outside the Temple's Gate in Fleet Street, and there, at a late hour of the night of May 10th, 1773, observes a gigantic old man laughing wildly, but having no one with him to share and aggrandize his emotion. Not that he is alone, but the young man beside him laughs only in politeness, and is inwardly puzzled, even shocked. Boswell has an exquisitely keen scent for comedy, for the fun that is latent in fine shades of character, but imaginative burlesque, anything that borders on lovely nonsense, he was not formed to savour. All the more does one revel in his account of what led up to the moment when Johnson, to support himself, laid hold of one of the posts at the side of the foot-pavement, and sent forth peals so loud that in the silence of the night his voice seemed to resound from Temple Bar to Fleet Ditch. No evening ever had an unlikelier ending. The omens were all for gloom. Johnson had gone to dine at General Paoli's, but was so ill that he had to leave before the meal was over. Later, he managed to go to Mr. Chambers' rooms in the Temple. He continued to be very ill there, but gradually felt better, and talked with a noble enthusiasm of keeping up the representation of respectable families, and was great on the dignity and propriety of male succession. Among his listeners, as it happened, was a gentleman for whom Mr. Chambers had, that day, drawn up a will devising his estate to his 3 sisters. The news of this might have been expected to make Johnson violent in wrath. But no! For some reason he grew violent only in laughter, and insisted thenceforth on calling that gentleman the testator, and chaffing him without mercy.
I dare say he thinks he has done a mighty thing. He won't stay till he gets home to his seat in the country to produce this wonderful deed. He'll call up the landlord of the first inn on the road, and, after a suitable preface upon mortality and the uncertainty of life, will tell him that he should not delay in making his will. And here, sir, will he say, is my will, which I have just made, with the assistance of one of the ablest lawyers in the kingdom, and he will read it to him. He believes he has made this will, but he did not make it. You, Chambers, made it for him. I hope you have had more conscience than to make him say, being of sound understanding. Ha, ha, ha. I hope he has left me a legacy. I'd have his will turned into verse like a ballad. These flights annoyed Mr. Chambers, and are recorded by Boswell with the apology that he wishes his readers to be acquainted with the slightest occasional characteristics of so eminent a man. Certainly, there is nothing ridiculous in the fact of a man making a will. But this is the measure of Johnson's achievement. He had created gloriously much out of nothing at all. There he sat, old and ailing, and unencouraged by the company, but soaring higher and higher into absurdity, more and more rejoicing, and still soaring and rejoicing after he had gone out into the night with Boswell, till at last, in Fleet Street, his paroxysms were too much for him, and he could no more. Echoes of that huge laughter come ringing down the ages. But is there also, perhaps, a note of sadness for us in them? Johnson's endless sociability came of his inherent melancholy. He could not bear to be alone, and his very mirth was but a mode of escape from the dark thoughts within him. Of these, the thought of death was the most dreadful to him, and the most insistent. He was for ever wondering how death would come to him, and how he would acquit himself in the extreme moment. A later, but not less devoted Anglican, meditating on his own end, wrote in his diary that to die in church appears to be a great euthanasia, but not, he quaintly and touchingly added, at a time to disturb worshippers. Both the sentiment here expressed and the reservation drawn would have been as characteristic of Johnson as they were of Gladstone. But to die of laughter, this too seems to me a great euthanasia, and I think that for Johnson to have died thus that night in Fleet Street would have been a grand ending to a life radically wretched. Well, he was destined to outlive another decade, and selfishly, who can wish such a life as his, or such as Boswell's, one jot shorter? Strange, when you come to think of it, that of all the countless folk who have lived before our time on this planet, not one is known in history or in legend as having died of laughter. Strange, too, that not to one of all those characters in romance has such an end been allotted. Has it ever struck you what a chance Shakespeare missed when he was finishing the second part of King Henry IV? Falstaff was not the man to stand cowed and bowed while the new young king lectured him and cast him off. Little by little, as Hal proceeded in that portentous allocution, the humour of the situation would have mastered old Sir John. His face, blank with surprise at first, would presently have glowed and widened, and his whole bulk have begun to quiver. Lest he should miss one word, he would have mastered himself, but the final words would have been the signal for release of all the roars pent up in him. The welkin would have rung. The roars, belike, would have gradually subsided in dreadful rumblings of more than utterable or conquerable mirth. Thus, and thus only, might his life have been rounded off with dramatic fitness. Secundum ipsius naturam. He never should have been left to babble of green fields, and die, and it had been any Christum child. Falstaff is a triumph of comedic creation, because we are kept laughing equally at and with him. Nevertheless, if I had the choice of sitting with him at the Boar's Head, or with Johnson at the Turk's, I shouldn't hesitate for an instant. The agility of Falstaff's mind gains much of its effect by contrast with the massiveness of his body. But in contrast with Johnson's equal agility is Johnson's moral as well as physical bulk. His sallies tell the more startlingly because of the noble weight of character behind them. They are the better because he makes them. In Falstaff, there isn't this final incongruity and element of surprise. Falstaff is but a sublimated sample of the funny man. We cannot therefore laugh so greatly with him as with Johnson, nor even at him, because we are not tickled so much by the weak points of a character whose points are all weak ones, also because we have no reverence trying to impose restraint upon us. Still, Falstaff has indubitably the power to convulse us. I don't mean we ever are convulsed in reading Henry IV. No printed page, alas, can thrill us to extremities of laughter. These are ours only if the mirth-maker be a living man, whose jests we hear as they come fresh from his own lips. All I claim for Falstaff is that he would be able to convulse us if he were alive and accessible. Few, as I have said, are the humorists who can induce this state. To master and dissolve us, to give us the joy of being worn down and tired out with laughter, is a success to be won by no man save in virtue of a rare staying power. Laughter becomes extreme only if it be consecutive. There must be no pauses for recovery. Touch-and-go humour, however happy, is not enough. The jester must be able to grapple his theme and hang on to it, twisting it this way and that, and making it yield, magically, all manner of strange and precious things, one after another, without pause. He must have invention, keeping pace with utterance. He must be inexhaustible. Only so can he exhaust us. I have a friend whom I would praise. There are many other of my friends to whom I am indebted for much laughter, but I do believe that if all of them sent in their bills to-morrow, and all of them overcharged me not a little, the total of all those totals would be less appalling than that which looms, in my own vague estimate, of what I owe to Comus. Comus, I call him here, in observance of the line drawn between public and private virtue, and in full knowledge that he would, of all men, be the least glad to be quite personally thanked and laurelled in the market-place for the hours he has made memorable among his cronies. No one is so diffident as he, no one so self-postponing. Many people have met him again and again without faintly suspecting anything much in him. Many of his acquaintance, friends too, relatives even, have lived and died in the belief that he was quite ordinary. Thus is he the more greatly valued by his cronies. Thus do we pride ourselves on possessing some curious right quality to which alone he is responsive. But it would seem that either this asset of ours or its effect on him is intermittent. He can be dull and null enough with us sometimes, a mere asker of questions, or drawer of comparisons between this and that brand of cigarettes, or full expatiator on the merits of some new patent razor. A whole hour and more may be wasted in such humdrums and darkness. And then something will have happened. There has come a spark in the murk. A flame now, presage of a radiance. Comus has begun. His face is a great part of his equipment. A cast of it might be somewhat akin to the comic mask of the ancients, but no cast could be worthy of it. Mobility is the essence of it. It flickers and shifts in accord to the matter of his discourse. It contracts and it expands. Is there anything its elastic can't express? Comus would be eloquent even if he were dumb, and he is mellifluous. His voice, while he develops an idea or conjures up a scene, takes on a peculiar richness and unction. If he be describing an actual scene, voice and face are adaptable to those of the actual persons therein. But it is not in such mimicry that he excels. As a reporter, he has rivals. For the most part, he moves on a higher plane than of mere fact. He imagines, he creates, giving you not a person but a type, a synthesis, and not what anywhere has been, but what anywhere might be. What, as one feels, for all the absurdity of it, just would be. He knows his world well, and nothing human is alien to him. But certain skeins of life have a special hold on him, and he on them. In his youth he wished to be a clergyman, and over the clergy of all grades and denominations his genius hovers and swoops and ranges with a special mastery. Lawyers he loves less, yet the legal mind seems to lie almost as wide open to him as the sacerdotal. And the legal manner, in all its phases, he can unerringly burlesque. In the minds of journalists, diverse journalists, he is not less thoroughly at home, so that, of the wild contingencies imagined by him, there is none about which he cannot reel off an oral leader or middle in the likeliest style, and with as much ease as he can preach a high church or low church sermon on it. Nor are his improvisations limited by prose. If a theme call for nobler treatment, he becomes an unflagging fountain of ludicrously adequate blank verse. Or, again, he may deliver himself in rhyme. There is no form of utterance that comes amiss to him, for interpreting the human comedy, or for broadening the farce into which that comedy is turned by him. Nothing can stop him when once he is in the vein. No appeals move him. He goes from strength to strength, while his audience is more and more piteously debilitated. What a gift to have been endowed with! What a power to wield! And how often I have envied Comus! But this envy of him has never taken root in me. His mind laughs, doubtless, at his own conceptions, but not his body. And if you tell him something that you have been sure will convulse him, you are likely to be rewarded with no more than a smile, betokening that he sees the point. Incomparable laughter-giver, he is not much of a laugher. He is vintner, not toper. I would therefore not change places with him. I am well content to have been his beneficiary during 30 years, and to be so for as many more as may be given us. End of section 20. Recorded by Kirsten Wever. End of And Even Now by Max BEERBOHM.